Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime series for sleeping. Let's begin our 2-hour crime stories. A Detective Ray Castellano series, Case 1. The neon from the pink Flamingo Motel bled through the Venetian blinds, casting Detective Ray Castellanos' office in alternating shades of magenta and shadow. It was August 1967, and Miami was sweating like a whore in church. Ray didn't care about the heat, didn't care about the humidity that made his shirt stick to his back, and sure as hell didn't care about the 3 bodies that had turned up in the past week with their throats cut clean as a Sunday morning shave. What Ray cared about was the bottle of bourbon in his desk drawer, and whether the Dolphins would ever amount to anything worth a damn. Captain Morrison burst through the door without knocking, his face red as a boiled lobster. "Castellanos, we got another one." Ray didn't look up from his newspaper. "Another what, Cap? Another lecture about my attitude? Another complaint from some rich widow who thinks I was rude to her poodle? Another body, you son of a bitch. Same MO throat cut, position like they're praying, and this time it's someone who matters." That got Ray's attention. He folded his paper with deliberate slowness, the way a man folds his napkin after a particularly good meal. Someone who matters? In this swamp? That's news to me. Veronica Ashford. Ring any bells? It did. Veronica Ashford was old Miami money, the kind that built railroads and bought politicians like penny candy. She was also beautiful in that untouchable way that made men stupid and women jealous. Ray had met her once at a charity gala he'd been forced to attend after solving the Coral Gables kidnapping case. She'd been wearing diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. "Where?" Ray asked, already reaching for his jacket. "Bayfront Park. Jogger found her this morning around sunrise. Same as the others. Throat cut, position kneeling like she's praying to something, and not a damn thing missing." Ray stood, his 6-foot frame unfolding like a lazy cat. At 42, he'd seen enough bodies to fill a small cemetery and enough corruption to fill a large one. What he hadn't seen was a serial killer with this particular brand of artistry. The drive to Bayfront Park was a silent one. Morrison knew better than to try small talk with Ray when he was thinking, and Ray was definitely thinking. 3 bodies in a week wasn't random. 3 bodies positioned the same way wasn't coincidence. And 3 bodies with their throats cut by someone who knew what they were doing wasn't amateur hour. The first victim had been Carlos Mendez, a small-time numbers runner who operated out of a barbershop in Little Havana. The second was Patricia Wild, a cocktail waitress at the Fontainebleau, who serviced more than drinks to the high roller crowd. Both had been found kneeling, hands clasped as if in prayer, their life drained out through surgical precision cuts to their carotid arteries. Now Veronica Ashford made 3, and Ray was starting to see a pattern that made his teeth itch. The crime scene was a circus. Uniforms kept the growing crowd of gawkers and reporters at bay, while the coroner's boys did their dance around the body. Ray surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd been doing this dance for 20 years. Veronica lay in the same position as the others, but something was different. The other victims had been found in secluded spots: the alley behind Carlos's barbershop, the service entrance to Patricia's apartment building. But Veronica was displayed in the open, on the grass overlooking Biscayne Bay, where anyone could see her. "This one's different," Ray muttered, lighting a lucky strike. "How so?" Morrison asked, mopping his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "The others were hidden, tucked away like dirty secrets. This one's on display. Our killer's getting confident." Ray knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. Veronica Ashford had been a beautiful woman, and death hadn't changed that. Her blonde hair was arranged perfectly, her white dress unstained except for the dark stain around her throat. Her hands were positioned in prayer, just like the others. But there was something else, something that made Ray's cop instincts start buzzing like a hornet's nest. "She's wearing makeup," he said. "So? Fresh makeup, lipstick, powder, the works. You don't get dressed up to go for a morning jog in the park." Ray stood, his knees creaking in protest. "She wasn't killed here. She was killed somewhere else, cleaned up, and brought here. This is theater." The coroner, a thin man named Kowalski, who looked like he'd been embalmed himself, confirmed Ray's suspicion. Time of death was probably around midnight, maybe earlier. Rigor mortis suggests she's been dead at least 8 hours. Any defensive wounds? None, just like the others. She was probably drugged first, then killed. Ray nodded. A killer who drugged his victims wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for control, for the ability to arrange his victims just so. This wasn't about passion or rage. This was about something else entirely. The investigation led Ray through Miami's underbelly like a guided tour of hell. He started with Carlos Mendez's known associates, a collection of gamblers, loan sharks, and general lowlifes who populated the bars and back rooms of Little Havana. None of them had seen or heard anything unusual. But then again, none of them had seen or heard anything unusual since the Eisenhower administration. Patricia Wilde's trail was more interesting. The cocktail waitress had been keeping company with some heavy hitters, casino owners, hotel magnates, men who could buy and sell politicians like used cars. One name kept coming up: Vincent "Vinny" Torino, a businessman from New Jersey who'd been making waves in Miami's casino scene. Ray found Torino at the Mutiny Hotel, holding court in the bar like some kind of tropical Caesar. He was a small man with expensive tastes in the kind of tan that came from a bottle rather than the sun. "Detective Castellanos," Torino said, not bothering to stand. "I heard you wanted to talk." "That depends," Ray replied, settling into a chair without being invited. "You got anything interesting to say?" "I might. Depends on what you're buying." Ray ordered a bourbon, neat, and waited. Torino was the kind of man who couldn't stand silence, who had to fill every quiet moment with the sound of his own voice. "Poor Patricia," Torino said finally. "Such a waste. She was a good girl, you know. Took care of her customers, minded her own business." "What kind of customers?" "The kind who appreciate discretion, the kind who don't like their names in the papers." Ray sipped his bourbon and waited for more. "She was supposed to meet someone the night she died," Torino continued. "Regular customer, very particular about his preferences." "What kind of preferences?" "The kind that involved costumes and role-playing. Patricia was good at making men feel like they were in control, even when they weren't." Ray felt something click in his brain, like a puzzle piece finding its place. "This customer have a name?" "Called himself Father Miguel. Said he was a priest, but I had my doubts. Real priests don't usually request that their girls dress up like penitent sinners." The pieces were starting to come together, but Ray needed more. He spent the next 2 days digging through church records, interviewing priests, and following paper trails that led nowhere. But sometimes nowhere was exactly where you needed to be. Father Miguel Santos had been assigned to St. Mary's Cathedral 6 months ago, transferred from a small parish in Tallahassee after what the church records diplomatically referred to as personal difficulties. Ray had seen enough church scandals to know what that meant. St. Mary's was a Gothic revival monstrosity that squatted on the corner of Flagler and Miami Avenue like a stone toad. Ray found Father Santos in the confessional, which struck him as either ironic or appropriate, depending on your perspective. "Father Santos, Detective Castellanos, Miami PD, I'd like to ask you a few questions." Santos was a thin man in his 40s with the kind of nervous energy that came from too much caffeine and too little sleep. His hands shook slightly as he emerged from the confessional booth. "Detective? Is something wrong?" "That depends on your definition of wrong, Father. I'm investigating a series of murders, and your name came up?" Santos went pale, which was impressive considering he was already the color of fresh paper. "I don't understand. Patricia Wilde, ring any bells?" I don't know anyone by that name." Ray had been lied to by professionals, and Father Santos wasn't even in the amateur league. His tells were so obvious, he might as well have been wearing a sign. "That's interesting, Father, because she knew you, called you Father Miguel, said you had particular tastes when it came to recreational activities." Santos collapsed into a pew like a marionette with cut strings. "Oh God, oh my God. He's probably not taking your calls right now, Father. Why don't you try talking to me instead?" The story came out in fits and starts, punctuated by sobs and protestations of innocence. Santos admitted to visiting Patricia Wilde, admitted to the role-playing scenarios, admitted to paying for services that would have gotten him defrocked faster than a magician's assistant. But he swore he hadn't killed her. I was with her that night, he said, but I left around 10 o'clock. She was alive when I left, I swear it. What about the others? Carlos Mendez? Veronica Ashford? I don't know those names. I swear to you, detective, I only knew Patricia. Ray believed him. Santos was a weak man, a man who'd given in to temptation and was now paying the price. But he wasn't a killer. Killers had a different smell about them, a different way of moving through the world. That left Ray back at square one, but sometimes square one was where the real clues were hiding. The break came from an unexpected source. Ray was sitting in his office, staring at crime scene photos and trying to make sense of the pattern when his phone rang. Castellanos. Detective, this is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. I'm a psychiatrist at Jackson Memorial. I think I may have information about your case. Ray had learned to pay attention when doctors called. They saw things other people missed, noticed patterns that weren't obvious to cops or civilians. I'm listening. I've been treating a patient who's been having violent fantasies, religious imagery, themes of sin and redemption. He's been talking about the need to help people find absolution through death. What's his name? I can't tell you that. Doctor-patient privilege. But I can tell you that he fits the profile of your killer, and he's been escalating. Ray felt the familiar tingle that came when a case started to break open. What kind of escalation? He's been talking about a grand gesture, something that will make people pay attention to his message. He believes that certain types of sinners need to be helped to find redemption through death. What types of sinners? Gamblers, prostitutes, and the wealthy who've forgotten their moral obligations. He sees himself as an instrument of divine justice. Ray's mind raced. A numbers runner, a prostitute, and a wealthy socialite. 3 types of sinners, 3 perfect victims for someone with a God complex and a sharp knife. Doctor, I need you to think carefully. Has this patient ever mentioned specific locations? Specific people? I can't. Wait, there is something. He's been talking about a place where sinners gather, somewhere with bright lights and false promises. He called it a modern Sodom. Ray knew exactly what she meant. Miami Beach was full of places that could be described as modern Sodom, but there was one in particular that attracted all 3 types of sinners: the Flamingo Casino. The Flamingo wasn't officially a casino. Gambling was illegal in Florida, but it was an open secret that the back rooms of the upscale restaurant and nightclub hosted high-stakes games that attracted gamblers, prostitutes, and wealthy thrill-seekers from across the state. Ray had been there once on a case involving a cheating scandal that had ended with a dead bookie and a lot of unhappy customers. The place had given him the creeps then, and he suspected it was about to give him a lot more than creeps now. The Flamingo sat on Collins Avenue like a pink neon tumor, all curves and chrome and promises of easy money. Ray approached it like a hunter approaching a trap, careful and ready for anything. The main floor was standard nightclub fare: dim lighting, overpriced drinks, and music loud enough to damage your hearing. But Ray wasn't interested in the main floor. He was interested in the basement, where the real action happened. The basement was a different world. Smoke-filled rooms where men in expensive suits played poker with money that could buy small countries. Women who looked like they'd stepped out of magazine ads circulated with drinks and promises. And in the corner, watching it all with the intensity of a hawk watching mice, sat a man Ray had never seen before. He was tall and thin, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time indoors than was healthy. His dark hair was slicked back, and his eyes were the color of old ice. He wore a simple black suit that looked expensive but understated. Ray approached him casually, the way a customer might approach a host. "Hell of a place," Ray said, settling into the chair beside him. "Indeed," the man replied. His voice was soft, cultured, with just a hint of an accent Ray couldn't place. "A veritable den of iniquity. You don't approve? I find it educational. There's something fascinating about watching people damn themselves with such enthusiasm." Ray felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "You come here often?" "Often enough. I like to observe the different types of sinners. The gambler who believes luck will save him. The prostitute who believes her body is a commodity. The wealthy who believe their money makes them immune to judgment. Sounds like you've given this a lot of thought." "I have. Someone has to." Ray was reaching for his gun when the man stood up smoothly, too smoothly for someone who hadn't been expecting trouble. "You're Detective Castellanos," he said. "I've been expecting you." "Have you now? And who might you be?" "You can call me Gabriel. I've been trying to help your city find redemption, but I fear my message hasn't been properly understood." Ray's hand was on his gun now, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet." "Your message?" "That certain sins require the ultimate penance, that some people are so lost they can only find salvation through death." Carlos Mendez, Patricia Wilde, Veronica Ashford. You helped them find salvation? Gabriel smiled, and it was like looking at a shark. "I helped them find peace. They were suffering, Detective, trapped in cycles of sin they couldn't break. I freed them, and you positioned them like they were praying. In their final moments, they were praying. I gave them the gift of genuine repentance." Ray drew his gun. "Gabriel, or whatever your real name is, you're under arrest for the murders of Carlos Mendez, Patricia Wilde, and Veronica Ashford." Gabriel didn't move. "You can't arrest the hand of God, Detective. Watch me." What happened next happened fast. Gabriel's hand moved to his jacket, and Ray saw the flash of steel. But instead of a gun, it was a knife, the same kind of knife that had killed 3 people. Ray fired twice, center mass, and Gabriel went down like a dropped stone. The knife clattered across the floor, and the basement erupted in screams and chaos. Gabriel lay dying on the stained carpet, his pale eyes staring at the ceiling. Ray knelt beside him, close enough to hear his final words. "You don't understand," Gabriel whispered. "This city, it's full of sinners. I was just trying to help." "Help's on the way," Ray said, but they both knew it was too late. Gabriel died with a smile on his face, and Ray knew he'd carry that smile with him for the rest of his life. The investigation revealed that Gabriel's real name was Michael Thompson, a former seminary student who'd been expelled for inappropriate behavior and had been drifting from city to city ever since. He'd been living in a small apartment near the beach, the walls covered with newspaper clippings about sin and redemption and the need for divine justice. Ray found 3 more names on Gabriel's list, potential victims who would have been next if the case hadn't been solved. He notified them personally, watching their faces go pale as they realized how close they'd come to becoming another prayer position on a morgue slab. The case was closed, the paperwork filed, and the city went back to its normal routine of sun, sin, and secrets. Ray went back to his office, his bourbon, and his newspaper. But sometimes, late at night, when the neon from the Pink Flamingo Motel bled through his blinds, he'd think about Gabriel's final words and wonder if maybe, just maybe, the dead man had been right about one thing. Miami was full of sinners, and Ray Castellanos was probably one of them. The end came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday that dawned gray and humid like a hangover. Ray was reading about the Dolphins' latest loss when Captain Morrison walked in without knocking. "We got a problem, Ray." Ray didn't look up from his paper. "Let me guess, another body? 4 of them, same MO, same positioning, same surgical precision." Ray felt his blood turn to ice water. "That's impossible. Gabriel's dead. Gabriel's dead, but somebody's been studying his work, and whoever it is, they're better at it than he was." Ray folded his paper with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Outside, Miami shimmered in the heat like a mirage, beautiful and dangerous and full of secrets. "Where?" he asked. "The Flamingo Casino, basement level. Looks like our copycat wanted to make a statement." Ray stood up and reached for his jacket. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of sirens, but they seemed far away, like echoes from another world. "Ray," Morrison said, "you okay?" "Just peachy, Cap, just peachy." The neon from the Pink Flamingo Motel pulsed against the window like a heartbeat, and Ray Castellanos walked out into the Miami heat to meet whatever fresh hell was waiting for him. Because in a city full of sinners, the work was never really done. Detective Ray Castellanos case #2. 3 months after the Flamingo Casino copycat murders went cold, Detective Ray Castellanos was seriously considering retirement. Not because he was tired of the job. Hell, the job was the only thing keeping him sane. But because Miami was starting to feel like a broken record playing the same tune over and over. Murder, corruption, cover-up, repeat. It was October 1967 and the heat hadn't broken yet. Ray sat in his office at 2 a.m., nursing a bourbon and staring at a case file that made about as much sense as a screen door on a submarine. 5 bodies in 2 weeks, all found at tourist attractions around South Florida, all killed with the same surgical precision that had become Gabriel's calling card. The problem was, Gabriel was still dead. Ray had put 2 bullets in him personally, and the last time he checked, resurrection wasn't covered in the Miami PD training manual. The first body had been discovered at the Coral Castle in Homestead, that bizarre monument to obsession built by some lovesick Latvian who claimed he could move multi-ton blocks of coral with magnetism and the power of love. The victim was Tommy Ricci, a small-time hood who ran numbers for the Marcello family. Someone had positioned him in the castle's main chamber, sitting in the coral throne like he was holding court in hell. Ray remembered the crime scene like it was burned into his retinas. Tommy's throat had been cut with the same precision as Gabriel's victims. But there was something different about the positioning. Where Gabriel had arranged his victims in prayer, this killer had staged Tommy like he was a king surveying his domain. The second body turned up at the Edison and Ford Winter Estates in Fort Myers. Sarah Chen, a cocktail waitress from the Fontainebleau, who'd been supplementing her income with services that weren't on the hotel's official menu. She'd been found in Edison's laboratory, arranged like she was conducting an experiment, her hands positioned over glass beakers that contained her own blood. Body 3 was at the Ringling Museum in Sarasota. Marcus Webb, a wealthy real estate developer who'd been cutting corners on low-income housing projects. He'd been positioned in the museum's courtyard, arms outstretched like he was admiring the art, with his throat open like a crimson smile. The fourth victim was found at Weeki Wachee Springs, that kitschy underwater theater where mermaids perform for tourists. Lisa Valdez, a secretary who'd been embezzling from her employer's pension fund. She'd been positioned underwater in the Springs main theater, weighted down but arranged like she was swimming with the mechanical mermaids. And now there was a 5th body, which was why Ray was sitting in his office at 2 a.m. instead of home in bed like a normal person. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife through silk. Castellanos. Ray, it's Morrison. We got another one. Where? Monkey Jungle. And Ray, you're going to want to see this one in person. Ray had been to Monkey Jungle exactly once, on a date with a woman who'd thought it would be romantic to watch primates fling their own excrement at tourists. The relationship hadn't lasted, but the memory of that particular brand of chaos had stuck with him. The victim was Dr. Richard Hoffman, a psychiatrist who'd been treating wealthy clients with more money than sense. Someone had positioned him in the main monkey enclosure, seated on a bench like he was conducting a therapy session with the primates. His throat had been cut with the same surgical precision as the others. But there was something else, something that made Ray's cop instincts start buzzing like a live wire. He's been here all night, the coroner said. Monkeys won't go near him. It's like they can sense something. Ray studied the scene, his experienced eye taking in details that would have been invisible to civilians. The positioning was too perfect, too deliberate. This wasn't random violence. This was theater. Any witnesses? Security guard found him this morning. Says he didn't hear anything unusual during his rounds. Ray nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. 5 victims, 5 tourist attractions, 5 different ways of positioning the bodies. Gabriel had been obsessed with redemption and prayer. This killer was obsessed with something else entirely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ray was interviewing Dr. Hoffman's receptionist, a nervous woman named Betty who kept wringing her hands like she was trying to wring the truth out of them. Dr. Hoffman had been worried about something, she said. He'd been getting strange calls for the past few weeks. What kind of calls? Someone asking about his patients, specifically about patients who'd been treated for unusual conditions. Ray felt that familiar tingle. What kind of unusual conditions? Obsessive behavior, particularly patients who'd become fixated on specific locations or landmarks. The pieces started falling into place like dominoes in Ray's mind. He spent the rest of the day pulling patient records, interviewing Dr. Hoffman's colleagues, and following paper trails that led through Miami's psychiatric community. What he found made his blood run cold. Dr. Hoffman had been treating a patient named David Ashford for the past 6 months. David was the son of Veronica Ashford, the wealthy socialite who'd been Gabriel's third victim. Since his mother's death, David had been experiencing what the medical records diplomatically called severe psychological disturbance. But the really interesting part was what David had been fixated on. According to his file, he'd become obsessed with the idea that his mother's killer had been right about the need for redemption, but wrong about the method. David believed that sinners needed to be displayed in places of wonder and beauty, transformed into art that would inspire others to change their ways. Ray found David Ashford at his mother's estate in Coral Gables, a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of too much. David was in his late 20s, tall and thin like his mother, with a kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time indoors than was healthy. "Mr. Ashford? Detective Castellanos, I'd like to ask you a few questions about Dr. Hoffman." David looked up from the book he was reading, something thick and leather-bound that looked older than Florida itself. "Dr. Hoffman? I heard about what happened. Terrible tragedy. You were his patient." "I was. He was helping me work through some difficulties following my mother's death." Ray studied David's face, looking for the tells that would give him away. But David was calm, collected, almost serene. Either he was innocent or he was a much better actor than Father Santos had been. "These difficulties, they involved thoughts about the man who killed your mother?" "Gabriel? Yes, we discussed him quite a bit. Dr. Hoffman helped me understand that while Gabriel's methods were wrong, his underlying philosophy had merit." "What kind of merit?" David smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Ray's hand drift toward his gun. "Gabriel believed that redemption required death. I believe that redemption requires transformation. Art can transform people, Detective. It can make them see the beauty in truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable." "Is that what you were doing? Transforming people?" "I don't know what you mean," but Ray knew exactly what he meant. David Ashford had been studying Gabriel's work, learning from it, improving on it. Where Gabriel had been content to arrange his victims in prayer, David was creating elaborate tableaux that turned murder into performance art. "David Ashford, you're under arrest for the murders of Tommy Ricci, Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, Lisa Valdez, and Dr. Richard Hoffman." David didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply closed his book and stood up with the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. "You don't understand, Detective. I'm not a killer. I'm an artist, and art requires sacrifice." The confession came easily once David was in custody. He talked about each victim like they were components in a larger work, pieces in a puzzle that would eventually reveal a greater truth about the nature of sin and redemption. Tommy Ricci had been displayed as a king because he'd ruled over his small criminal empire with absolute authority. Sarah Chen had been positioned as a scientist because she'd been experimenting with men's desires. Marcus Webb had been arranged as an art lover because he'd been creating his own kind of beauty through exploitation. Lisa Valdez had been transformed into a mermaid because she'd been swimming in other people's money. And Dr. Hoffman had been positioned as a therapist because he'd been trying to cure David of his newfound artistic vision. Each display was carefully chosen, David explained during his interrogation. The locations, the positioning, the symbolism, it was all part of a larger narrative about the relationship between sin and beauty. Ray had heard a lot of confessions in his 20 years on the force, but this one was different. David wasn't confessing out of guilt or fear. He was confessing out of pride, like an artist explaining his masterpiece. "What about Gabriel?" Ray asked. "Did you know him?" "I studied his work, yes, but Gabriel was a primitive. He saw sin as something to be punished. I see it as something to be transformed. Into what? Into art, into beauty, into something that will make people think." Ray stared at David across the interrogation table, trying to understand the mind that could turn murder into philosophy. "You killed 5 people to make a point? I killed 5 sinners to create 5 works of art. The fact that they died was incidental to the larger purpose." The trial was a media circus. David's defense team argued that he was insane, that his mother's death had driven him to a psychological break that made him unable to distinguish between right and wrong. The prosecution argued that he was a cold-blooded killer who'd used his grief as an excuse to indulge in homicidal fantasies. Ray testified about the crime scenes, the evidence, the confession, but the whole time he couldn't shake the feeling that David was still performing, still turning his trial into another kind of art. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts, but with a recommendation for life in prison, rather than the electric chair due to mental illness. David received his sentence with the same calm he'd shown during his arrest. As they led him away, he turned to Ray and smiled. "Detective, do you think people will remember my work? I think they'll remember the people you killed." "That's the same thing, isn't it?" Ray didn't answer. He watched David disappear into the system, another killer processed and filed away in the great bureaucracy of justice. But late that night, sitting in his office with a bourbon and the case files, Ray found himself thinking about David's question. Would people remember his work? Would they see the elaborate crime scenes as art? Or would they see them as what they really were? The product of a sick mind that had confused murder with creativity. The answer came 6 months later, when Ray was investigating another case and found himself at the Coral Castle. The tour guide was telling a group of tourists about the recent murder, describing the crime scene in hushed, reverent tones. "The body was positioned right here," the guide said, pointing to the coral throne, "arranged like he was a king. Some people say it was the work of an artist, someone who understood the deeper meaning of the castle." Ray felt his stomach turn. David had been right. People were remembering his work. They were turning his murders into legends, his crime scenes into tourist attractions. That night, Ray wrote his letter of resignation. He was tired of a world where killers could become artists and murder could become art. He was tired of a city where the line between sin and redemption had become so blurred that no one could tell the difference anymore. But before he could submit the letter, his phone rang. "Castellanos. Ray, it's Morrison. We got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Remember that Gabriel copycat from the Flamingo? The one who killed 4 people and disappeared?" Ray felt his blood turn to ice. "Yeah? We just found his calling card at the Vizcaya Museum. And Ray, this one's different. This one's got style." Ray looked at his resignation letter, then slowly tore it up. Outside, Miami shimmered in the heat like a mirage, beautiful and dangerous and full of secrets. "I'll be right there," he said. Because in a city where killers could become artists and murder could become art, the work was never really done. The case files on David Ashford went into the archives, but Ray kept copies for himself. Sometimes, late at night, when the neon from the Pink Flamingo Motel bled through his blinds, he'd read through David's confession and try to understand the mind that could turn death into beauty. He never did understand it, but he never stopped trying. And somewhere in the Florida State Hospital for the criminally insane, David Ashford sat in his cell and sketched elaborate diagrams of crime scenes that would never be, masterpieces that would never be created, art that would never be born. Because art, like justice, sometimes required sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was sanity itself. Detective Ray Castellanos' case #3, January 1968, brought a cold snap to Miami that had the locals acting like the world was ending. Ray Castellanos sat in his office watching his breath fog in the unheated air, thinking that 40-degree weather was the least of his problems. The real problem was sitting on his desk in the form of a manila folder marked Midnight Caller, case #680127. 6 women dead in 3 weeks, all found in their apartments with no signs of forced entry. All killed between midnight and 3 a.m., all with their throats cut in the same precise surgical manner that had become Miami's signature calling card for crazy. What made this case different wasn't the method. Ray had seen enough throat cutting to last 3 lifetimes. What made it different was the phone calls. Each victim had received a call exactly 24 hours before their death. The caller would speak for precisely 3 minutes, always the same message, always in the same calm, measured tone. The Miami PD had managed to record one of these calls when victim number 4, Janet Morrison, had had the presence of mind to turn on her answering machine. Ray had listened to that recording so many times he could recite it from memory. "Tomorrow at the stroke of midnight, you will receive your final absolution. Prepare yourself for judgment. Make peace with your sins. The reaper comes not in anger, but in mercy." 3 minutes, every time. Then the line would go dead. The victims had all called the police after receiving their calls. All had been given protection details. All had been found dead anyway, their police guards unconscious in the hallway, drugged with some kind of sedative that left them with splitting headaches and no memory of what had happened. Ray was contemplating the bottom of his bourbon glass when the knock came at his door. He didn't look up. "We're closed. Come back when the sun's shining and I give a damn." The door opened anyway and a woman's voice said, "Detective Castellanos, I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I think I can help you catch your midnight caller." Ray looked up and for the first time in months found himself genuinely surprised. Dr. Elena Vasquez was not what he'd expected. She was tall and elegant, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and eyes the color of strong coffee. She wore a simple gray suit that looked expensive but not flashy, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were worth. "Dr. Vasquez, let me guess. Psychiatrist?" "Criminal psychologist, actually. I specialize in serial killer behavior patterns. The FBI sent me down from Quantico to consult on your case." Ray gestured to the chair across from his desk. "The FBI thinks we need help. The FBI thinks you're dealing with something unusual. A killer who announces his intentions 24 hours in advance isn't following typical patterns." Elena settled into the chair with fluid grace, and Ray found himself noticing things he hadn't noticed about a woman in years. The way she crossed her legs, the slight accent in her voice that suggested she'd been born somewhere more exotic than Virginia. The fact that she was looking at him like he was something worth studying. "So what's your theory, Doc?" "I think your killer is operating under a compulsion that's part religious delusion, part psychological obsession. The 24-hour warning isn't about giving his victims time to prepare. It's about giving himself time to savor the anticipation." Ray leaned back in his chair. "And the fact that he's getting past police protection? That suggests either inside knowledge of police procedures or," Elena paused, studying Ray's face, "or someone with legitimate access to the crime scenes. Someone like a cop, or a paramedic, or a doctor, or anyone else who might have reason to be in those buildings at odd hours." Ray had been thinking the same thing for the past week, but hearing it from someone else made it real in a way that was both satisfying and terrifying. "You think we're looking for someone with a badge?" "I think you're looking for someone who understands how the system works. Someone who knows police procedures well enough to circumvent them." Over the next 3 days, Ray and Elena worked together to build a profile of the midnight caller. They interviewed the families of the victims, studied the crime scenes, and analyzed the phone recordings with the kind of scientific precision that Ray had never applied to police work. Elena was different from any woman Ray had ever worked with. She was smart without being condescending, tough without being harsh, and she had a way of asking questions that made him think about things from angles he'd never considered. "Tell me about the first victim," she said on their second day working together. They were sitting in a diner near the beach, surrounded by crime scene photos and case files. Sandra Phillips, 28, worked as a secretary for a law firm downtown. No known enemies, no obvious connection to organized crime. Found dead in her apartment on January 5th. What about her personal life? Divorced, no kids. Dated casually, but nothing serious. According to her friends, she was planning to move back to Ohio to be closer to her family. Elena made a note on her legal pad. And the second victim? Marie Gonzalez, 31, worked as a nurse at Jackson Memorial. Again, no enemies, no obvious motive. Found dead January 8th. Both women were planning major life changes? Ray looked at Elena with new respect. "How'd you know that?" Marie had submitted her resignation at the hospital. She was planning to go back to school to become a doctor. "I'm guessing the others were also at transition points in their lives." Ray flipped through the case files, his mind making connections he'd missed before. "Jesus, you're right. Victim 3, Catherine Reed, had just gotten engaged. Victim 4, Janet Morrison, was starting her own business. Victim 5, Lisa Park, was planning to move to California. Victim 6, Angela Torres, had just filed for divorce. So our killer is targeting women who are making positive changes in their lives. Women who are moving toward hope, toward better futures. But why?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out the diner window at the gray January sky. I think our killer sees these women as escaping something, and he can't bear the thought of escape. That night, Ray found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, having dinner with a woman he actually wanted to talk to. Elena had suggested they grab something to eat while they went over the case files, and somehow grabbing something to eat had turned into a real meal at a real restaurant. "So what brought you to criminal psychology?" Ray asked over wine that was better than anything he'd tasted in months. "My sister was murdered when I was in college," Elena said without preamble. "The killer was never caught. I decided I wanted to understand how minds like that work." "I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago, but it taught me that there's always a pattern, always a reason. Even when the reason is insane, it's still a reason." Ray found himself telling Elena things he'd never told anyone about the cases that had haunted him, about the victims he'd failed to save, about the way Miami had changed from a sleepy southern city to a playground for killers and conmen. "Why do you stay?" she asked. "Because someone has to. Because if I don't, who will?" Elena smiled, and for the first time in months, Ray felt something other than cynicism stirring in his chest. The break in the case came on January 29th, when the midnight caller made his 7th call. But this time, something was different. The victim was supposed to be Margaret Chen, a social worker who'd been planning to adopt a child. But Margaret had gone out of town unexpectedly, and her roommate, a woman named Susan Torres, had answered the phone instead. "Tomorrow at the stroke of midnight, you will receive your final absolution," the caller had said, apparently not realizing he was talking to the wrong person. Susan Torres was smart enough to call the police immediately and smart enough to insist on protective custody, but she was also smart enough to volunteer as bait. "If he's expecting to find Margaret and he finds me instead, maybe we can catch him off guard," she'd said. Ray had wanted to say no. Every instinct he'd developed over 20 years of police work told him it was too dangerous, but Elena had convinced him otherwise. "She's right," Elena had said. "If we can disrupt his pattern, we might be able to force him into making a mistake." So they'd set up surveillance in Margaret Chen's apartment building, positioned officers at every entrance, and waited for midnight to come. The midnight caller arrived at 11:47 p.m., dressed as a paramedic and carrying a medical bag that probably contained more than bandages. He used a key to enter the building, a key that he shouldn't have had access to unless he was exactly who Elena thought he was. Ray watched from his hiding spot as the caller made his way up the stairs to the 3rd floor. He moved with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be in that building at that time of night. The caller reached Margaret Chen's apartment and used another key to let himself in. Ray waited 30 seconds, then followed. What he found inside made his blood run cold. Susan Torres was unconscious on the couch, a syringe lying on the floor beside her. But she was breathing, which meant Ray had arrived in time. The midnight caller was standing over her with a knife, but when he heard Ray enter the apartment, he turned around slowly, like a man who'd been expecting this moment. "Detective Castellanos," he said, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." Ray stared at the face beneath the paramedic's cap and felt his world shift on its axis. The midnight caller was Detective Frank Morrison, his own captain's nephew, a cop who'd been on the force for 8 years and had access to every case file, every protective detail, every piece of information that had allowed him to stay one step ahead of the investigation. "Frank Morrison, I should have known." "You should have, but then again, you always were better at drinking than detecting." Ray's hand moved to his gun, but Frank was faster. The knife flew across the room like a silver bird, and Ray felt it bite into his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. Frank advanced with another knife, his face calm and serene. "You know, Detective, I've been looking forward to this moment. You and that FBI bitch have been getting too close." Ray struggled to his feet, blood running down his arm. "Why, Frank? Why kill those women?" "Because they were leaving. Because they thought they could just walk away from their lives, start over somewhere else. Because they thought they deserved happiness." "And you don't think they did?" "I don't think anyone does. I think we're all trapped in the lives we've made, and the only escape is death." Frank lunged with the knife, but Ray was ready for him. 20 years of police work had taught him how to fight when he was hurt, how to use pain as fuel instead of letting it slow him down. The two men grappled in the small apartment, crashing into furniture and walls. Frank was younger and faster, but Ray was meaner and more desperate. When Frank's knife came down toward Ray's chest, Ray caught his wrist and twisted hard enough to hear bones crack. Frank screamed and dropped the knife. Ray hit him with a right cross that sent him stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. "Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for the murders of Sandra Phillips, Marie Gonzalez, Catherine Reed, Janet Morrison, Lisa Park, Angela Torres, and the attempted murder of Susan Torres." Frank laughed, blood running from his nose. "You think this is over? You think I'm the only one who sees the truth about this city?" "What truth?" "That it's all a lie. The hope, the dreams, the idea that people can change. It's all a fucking lie, and I was just helping people see it." Ray cuffed Frank to the kitchen radiator and checked on Susan Torres. She was unconscious but breathing steadily. The syringe on the floor had contained a sedative, not a fatal dose. Elena arrived with the backup Ray had called for, and together they watched as Frank Morrison was led away in handcuffs. He was still laughing as they put him in the patrol car. "You know what the really sick part is?" Ray said as they stood on the sidewalk watching the patrol car disappear into the Miami night. "What?" Part of me understands what he was thinking. Part of me knows exactly what he meant about the lies we tell ourselves. Elena turned to look at him, her dark eyes serious. "But you don't believe it." "No, I don't believe it. Because if I did, I'd have to believe that there's no point in trying to save anyone. And if there's no point in trying to save anyone, then there's no point in doing this job. And if there's no point in doing this job," Ray looked at Elena, at this woman who'd come into his life and made him remember what it felt like to care about something other than the bottom of a bourbon glass. "Then there's no point in anything." The trial of Frank Morrison lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The keys to the victim's buildings, the paramedic uniform, the recorded phone calls that matched his voice pattern. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Frank was sentenced to death in the electric chair, but he appealed, and the case dragged through the courts for months. Ray didn't care. He'd caught the killer, saved Susan Torres, and proven that even in a city full of corruption and madness, justice was still possible. More importantly, he'd found something he thought was lost forever: the ability to hope. Elena stayed in Miami after the case was closed, taking a position as a consulting psychologist with the Miami PD. She and Ray began seeing each other regularly, and for the first time in years, Ray found himself looking forward to something other than the end of his shift. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony attended by Morrison, Susan Torres, and a handful of Ray's fellow detectives. It wasn't the kind of wedding that made society pages, but it was real, and after everything Ray had seen, real was enough. The night after their wedding, Ray and Elena sat on their hotel balcony, overlooking Biscayne Bay, watching the lights of Miami twinkle in the darkness. "So what now?" Elena asked. "Now we go back to work. There's always another case, always another killer." "You don't sound discouraged by that." Ray thought about Frank Morrison, about Gabriel, about David Ashford, and all the other broken minds he'd encountered in his career. "No, I'm not discouraged, because for every killer out there, there's someone like you trying to understand them. Someone like Susan Torres willing to risk her life to stop them. Someone like me stubborn enough to keep hunting them." Elena leaned against his shoulder, and Ray felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. "Besides," he added, "someone's got to keep this city from drowning in its own madness. And you think we can do that?" Ray looked out at Miami, at the neon and the darkness, and the endless possibilities for both good and evil that pulsed through the city's veins like blood. "I think we can try, and sometimes trying is enough." 3 weeks later, Ray's phone rang at 2 a.m. Another body, another crime scene, another killer loose in the city. But this time, when he got dressed and headed out into the Miami night, he wasn't going alone. Elena was already awake, already getting dressed, already reaching for her case files and her psychological profiles. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," Ray replied, and together they walked out into the darkness to face whatever fresh hell Miami had prepared for them. Because in a city where hope and madness walked hand in hand, the work was never done. But now at least Ray wasn't doing it alone. Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime series for sleeping, where true crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Let's go. Detective Ray Castellano's case #4. April 1968 brought thunderstorms to Miami that seemed to roll in from the Gulf like God's own artillery barrage. Detective Ray Castellano sat in his office listening to the rain hammer against the windows, thinking that after 6 months of marriage, he was finally starting to understand what happiness felt like. The bourbon in his desk drawer remained untouched most nights now, replaced by dinner conversations with Elena and the kind of sleep that came from having someone worth going home to. The contentment lasted until Captain Morrison walked through his door carrying a case file thick enough to choke a horse. "Ray, we got a problem. A big one." Ray looked up from the report he was writing, noting the deep lines around Morrison's eyes. The captain had aged 10 years since his nephew Frank had been convicted of the Midnight Caller murders. Family shame had a way of eating a man from the inside out. What kind of problem? The kind that doesn't make sense. 7 people, all different ages, all different backgrounds, all found dead in their homes over the past 2 weeks. No signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. Coroner says they all died of what looks like massive stroke or heart failure. Ray frowned. "That's not murder, Cap. That's bad luck." It would be, except for one thing. All 7 victims had been to see the same doctor in the week before they died. Dr. Marcus Aldrich runs a private practice in Coral Gables, specializes in something called memory recovery therapy. Ray felt that familiar tingle, the one that told him he was about to step into something deeper and darker than it appeared on the surface. Memory recovery therapy claims he can help people remember things they've forgotten, traumatic experiences, childhood memories, that kind of thing, uses some kind of experimental technique involving hypnosis and drugs. "And you think this Dr. Aldrich is killing his patients?" Morrison dropped the case file on Ray's desk. "I think 7 people went to see him and ended up dead. That's either the worst bedside manner in medical history or something else entirely." Ray opened the file and started reading. The victims were indeed diverse. A 60-year-old retired teacher, a 35-year-old businessman, a 28-year-old housewife, a 42-year-old mechanic, a 50-year-old nurse, a 31-year-old artist, and a 26-year-old secretary. Nothing connected them except their visits to Dr. Aldrich's office. "I want you and Elena to check this out," Morrison said. "Her FBI background might be useful if we're dealing with some kind of medical malpractice situation." Ray nodded, already reaching for his phone to call Elena. Working cases with his wife had become one of the unexpected pleasures of his job. She saw patterns he missed, asked questions he wouldn't think to ask, and had a way of getting witnesses to open up that Ray had never mastered. They found Dr. Marcus Aldrich at his office on Miracle Mile, a sleek glass building that looked like it belonged in the future rather than 1968. Aldrich himself was a man in his 50s, with silver hair, expensive clothes, and the kind of smile that politicians use when they were lying about their campaign promises. "Detective Castellanos, Dr. Vasquez," he said, rising from behind a desk that probably cost more than Ray's annual salary. "I've been expecting you." "Have you?" Ray settled into one of the leather chairs facing Aldrich's desk. "And why's that?" "Because 7 of my patients have died in the past 2 weeks. I imagine that's raised some questions." Elena leaned forward slightly. "What kind of questions has it raised for you, Dr. Aldrich?" "The obvious ones. Whether my treatment methods are safe, whether I'm somehow responsible for their deaths, whether I should discontinue my practice." Ray studied Aldrich's face, looking for the tells that would give him away. But the doctor was calm, professional, almost serene. Either he was innocent or he was a sociopath with excellent self-control. "Tell us about your memory recovery therapy," Elena said. "I help people remember things they've forgotten or repressed, traumatic experiences, childhood memories, events that their minds have blocked out as a defense mechanism. I use a combination of hypnosis, guided visualization, and carefully controlled pharmaceutical assistance." "What kind of pharmaceutical assistance?" "Nothing dangerous. Mild sedatives, memory enhancers, substances that help patients relax and access buried memories. All perfectly legal, all carefully monitored. Ray wasn't buying it. And what kinds of memories were these 7 people trying to recover? Aldrich's smile faltered slightly. I'm afraid that's confidential. Doctor-patient privilege. You understand. Doctor-patient privilege ends when the patient's dead, Ray said. All 7 of them. Nevertheless, I can't share the details of their treatment without a court order. Elena and Ray exchanged glances. In their 6 months of working together, they'd developed a kind of shorthand communication. Elena's slight nod told Ray she thought Aldrich was hiding something significant. Dr. Aldrich, Elena said, in your professional opinion, is it possible that recovering certain memories could be traumatic enough to cause fatal heart failure or stroke? Theoretically, yes. Severe psychological trauma can trigger physical responses, but I've never seen it happen in practice. Until now, Ray said. Until now. They left Aldrich's office with more questions than answers, but Ray had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that Dr. Marcus Aldrich was neck-deep in something that smelled worse than low tide in August. What do you think? Ray asked Elena as they walked back to their car. I think he's lying about something. The question is what? And how do we prove it? Elena smiled and Ray recognized the expression. It was the same look she got when she was about to suggest something that would either solve the case or get them both killed. We become patients. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Elena would pose as a patient seeking to recover repressed memories from her childhood. Ray would provide surveillance and backup, ready to intervene if things went wrong. What could possibly go wrong with letting his wife undergo experimental psychiatric treatment from a doctor who might be a serial killer? Elena's appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday. She'd created a backstory about childhood trauma, repressed memories, and the need to understand her past in order to move forward with her future. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, but fictional enough to keep her safe. At least, that was the theory. Ray positioned himself in a van across the street from Aldrich's office, equipped with recording equipment and a clear view of the building's entrance. Elena wore a wire, though they both knew that if Aldrich discovered it, the surveillance would be the least of their problems. The session began at 2 p.m. Ray listened through his headphones as Elena was led into Aldrich's office as they discussed her supposed childhood trauma, as Aldrich began the process of hypnosis. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Aldrich's voice was calm and professional. Elena's responses were exactly what they'd rehearsed. But then something changed. I'm going to give you something to help you relax, Aldrich said. Just a mild sedative. It will help you access deeper memories. Ray heard the sound of a syringe being prepared, and every instinct he'd developed over 20 years of police work started screaming. Elena hadn't mentioned anything about injections in their planning. What kind of sedative? Elena asked, her voice slightly slurred. Something special. Something that will help you remember things you never knew you'd forgotten. Ray was already moving, abandoning the surveillance van and heading for the building. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He reached Aldrich's office just as Elena's voice stopped coming through the wire. The receptionist tried to stop him, but Ray had his badge out and his gun drawn. Miami PD, where's Dr. Aldrich? He's in session. You can't just... Ray pushed past her and kicked open the door to Aldrich's office. What he found inside made his blood turn to ice. Elena was unconscious in a reclining chair, electrodes attached to her temples. Aldrich was standing over her with a syringe in his hand, but when Ray entered, he turned with the calm expression of a man who'd been expecting this moment. Detective Castellanos, right on time. Step away from my wife. Your wife is fine. She's just experiencing a little memory adjustment. Ray kept his gun trained on Aldrich while checking Elena's pulse. She was alive, but her breathing was shallow and her pulse was weak. What did you give her? The same thing I gave the others. A cocktail of my own design. It allows me to access not just repressed memories, but all memories. Every experience, every moment, every detail of a person's life. And then what? Aldrich smiled, and Ray saw madness in that smile. Then I take them. Take them? The memories. I extract them, transfer them, make them my own. Do you have any idea what it's like to live 7 different lives? To have 7 different sets of experiences? 7 different perspectives on the world? Ray felt sick. You're stealing their memories? I'm preserving them. When the human brain is stripped of its memories, it simply stops. The patients die peacefully, and their experiences live on in me. You're insane. I'm enlightened. Do you know what it's like to remember being a child in 7 different families? To have experienced love and loss and joy and pain from 7 different perspectives. I am becoming something more than human. Ray's finger tightened on the trigger. You're becoming a monster. I'm becoming a god. Elena stirred in the chair, her eyes fluttering open. Ray, I'm here. You're going to be okay. Aldrich laughed. She's not going to be okay. The process has already begun. In a few minutes, she'll start to forget things. Her childhood, her education, her experiences. And then she'll forget how to breathe. Ray felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold, focused anger that made him dangerous. Is there an antidote? There might be, but you'd have to let me complete the process to find out. Not happening. Then she dies, and you get to watch. Ray looked at Elena, at the woman who'd brought hope back into his life, and made his decision. He shot Aldrich in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into his desk. The antidote, Ray said, pressing the gun to Aldrich's head. Now! There is no antidote, Aldrich gasped. The process is irreversible. Ray felt his world collapsing. You're lying. I'm dying. Why would I lie? But then Elena spoke, her voice weak but determined. Ray, the syringe, on his desk. Ray looked and saw a second syringe filled with clear liquid. What is it? Naloxone, Elena said. It's a drug that reverses opioid overdoses. If his cocktail included opioids. Ray grabbed the syringe and injected it into Elena's arm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her breathing deepened, her pulse strengthened, and her eyes focused. How did you know? Ray asked. I smelled almonds on the needle. Reminded me of a case I worked where someone tried to poison a witness with a cocktail that included opiates and cyanide. The naloxone won't reverse everything, but it might reverse enough. Aldrich was still alive, barely. Ray knelt beside him, the gun still pressed to his head. The 7 patients. What memories did you steal from them? Everything, Aldrich whispered. Their first kiss, their wedding day, their children being born, their fears, their dreams, their loves. All of it. And now? Now I die with 7 lifetimes of memories. 7 different ways of understanding what it means to be human. Aldrich closed his eyes and died with a smile on his face. Ray helped Elena to her feet, holding her steady as she regained her balance. How do you feel? Like I've been hit by a truck, but I remember everything. My childhood, my sister, meeting you, our wedding. He didn't get far enough into the process. Thank God. Thank naloxone, and thank the fact that you came in when you did. Ray looked around Aldrich's office at the equipment designed to steal memories, at the files containing the details of 7 lives that had been erased so one man could experience them secondhand. What kind of man steals memories, he asked. A man who never had any worth keeping, Elena replied. The investigation into Dr. Marcus Aldrich's crimes took months. They found detailed records of his memory extraction procedures, recordings of his sessions with patients, and evidence of other victims dating back years. The man had been a predator feeding on human experience, consuming other people's lives because his own had been empty. The case made national headlines. The FBI launched a task force to investigate similar crimes in other cities. Medical boards across the country began cracking down on experimental psychiatric treatments. But for Ray and Elena, the real impact was more personal. They'd faced something that could have destroyed their marriage before it had really begun, and they'd come through it stronger. I keep thinking about what he said, Elena told Ray one evening as they sat on their balcony overlooking the bay, about experiencing 7 different lifetimes. What about it? I don't need 7 lifetimes. I just need this one, with you. Ray pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his. That's all I need too. Even in a city like Miami? Even with all the madness we see? Ray looked out at the city lights, at the neon and the darkness and the endless possibilities. for both good and evil that pulse through Miami's veins. Especially in a city like Miami, someone has to be the memory keepers. Someone has to remember the victims, remember the truth, remember that justice is possible even when everything else seems insane. The memory keepers? That's what we are. We remember the people who can't remember themselves. We keep their stories alive. We make sure they're not forgotten. Elena smiled and leaned against his shoulder. I like that. The memory keepers. 3 weeks later, Ray's phone rang at 3 a.m. Another body, another crime scene, another killer loose in the city. But this time, when he got dressed and headed out into the Miami night, he wasn't just going to catch a killer. He was going to make sure that whoever had died would be remembered. Elena was already awake, already getting dressed, already reaching for her case files and her psychological profiles. Ready? She asked. Ready, Ray replied. And together they walked out into the darkness to face whatever fresh hell Miami had prepared for them. Because in a city where memories could be stolen and lives could be erased, someone had to remember. Someone had to keep the stories alive. Someone had to make sure that the dead were not forgotten. And Ray Castellanos and Elena Vasquez were exactly those someones. Detective Ray Castellanos case #5. The neon signs of Sunset Boulevard cast everything in 6 shades of red and blue, like bruises on the night sky. Detective Ray Castellanos pulled his unmarked Plymouth to the curb outside the Flamingo Lounge, where the body had been found 3 hours ago. The rain had started again, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the city's sins back at itself. "Fourth one this month," Elena said, stubbing out her cigarette as she got out of the passenger seat. Even after 2 years of marriage, Ray still felt that little catch in his chest when he looked at her. She'd traded her undercover work for a detective's shield, but she still moved like a cat through the shadows. "Fourth one we know about," Ray corrected, adjusting his fedora against the drizzle. The memory of Dr. Aldrich's victims still haunted him sometimes. All those stolen lives, all those stolen stories. It had changed him, made him more protective of the people who couldn't protect themselves. Made him more protective of Elena, though she'd made it clear she didn't need protecting. The victim was sprawled in the alley behind the club, a young woman in a torn cocktail dress. Her name was Dolores Martinez, 23, a dancer at the Flamingo. The killer had carved a symbol into her forehead, a crescent moon with a star inside it. "Same mark as the others," Elena observed, crouching beside the body. She'd learned to read death the way other people read newspapers. "But this one's different." Ray knelt beside his wife, following her gaze. "The dress isn't torn from the struggle. It's been cut deliberately, like a pattern. And look at her hands." Elena lifted the victim's right hand with a pencil. The fingernails were painted black, but underneath the polish, the nails themselves had been filed to sharp points. "That's not how she died. Someone did this to her after—" Sergeant Murphy approached, his Irish accent thick with disgust. "Coroner says she's been dead maybe 4 hours. No witnesses, but the barkeep inside says she left with a man around midnight. Tall, dark hair, expensive suit." "Description fits half the men in this city," Ray muttered. "What about the other girls?" "All dancers, all between 20 and 25, all found with that symbol carved in their foreheads." Murphy flipped through his notebook. "First one was Carmen Rosales, found in Griffith Park, then Linda Walsh behind the Ambassador Hotel. Third was Betty Chen near Chinatown." Elena stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. 4 different neighborhoods, 4 different venues, but all dancers. What's the connection? Ray lit a lucky strike and let the smoke mix with the rain. Maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe it's not about where they worked. Maybe it's about who they worked for. The next morning found Ray and Elena in the basement of the Parker Center, going through files that most cops forgot existed. The underground dance circuit wasn't officially police business. Too many judges and city councilmen were regular customers. But Ray had learned that the city's official business and its real business were often 2 different things. "Here," Elena said, spreading photographs across the metal table. "All 4 victims worked the private circuit at some point. Not just the clubs, the real money jobs." Ray studied the photos. Carmen Rosales at a mansion in Beverly Hills, Linda Walsh at a yacht party in Marina del Rey, Betty Chen at what looked like a private club in downtown, And now Dolores Martinez, who had a whole folder of photographs from various exclusive events. They were all working for the same booking agency, Elena continued, Sunset Dreams Entertainment, run by a woman named Vivian Cross. Ray knew the name. Every cop in LA knew the name, even if they pretended not to. Vivian Cross ran the classiest escort service in the city, the kind that catered to studio executives and oil barons, the kind that had judges and police commissioners on speed dial. She's untouchable, Ray said. Maybe, but her girls aren't. Elena pulled out a manila folder. I made some calls. 3 other dancers have gone missing in the past 6 months. All worked for Sunset Dreams. All disappeared without a trace. Ray felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when they were hunting Dr. Aldrich, the sense that they were dealing with something bigger than murder, something that went right to the heart of the city's corruption. We need to talk to the other girls, he said. Already arranged. But Ray, Elena's voice carried a warning. We're going to have to go in through the back door. Official channels will get us nowhere. Ray nodded. He'd learned to trust Elena's instincts, especially when it came to the city's shadow economy. She understood it in ways that his years of street work had never taught him. The Velvet Room was the kind of place that didn't exist on any maps. Located in the basement of a downtown office building, it catered to men who needed their entertainment to be both exclusive and invisible. Ray and Elena posed as a wealthy couple from San Francisco, looking for sophisticated entertainment for a private party. The maitre d' was a thin man with dead eyes and manicured fingernails. He studied their fake credentials with the attention of a jeweler examining diamonds. Mr. and Mrs. Castellanos, he said finally, Vivian will see you now. Vivian Cross was 50-something, with platinum hair and the kind of face that had been beautiful once and was now carefully maintained. She wore a black dress that cost more than most people made in a year, and her office was decorated with photographs of her with various celebrities and politicians. You're interested in private entertainment, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. What kind of private entertainment? The kind that's memorable, Elena said, playing her part perfectly. We have particular tastes. Vivian's smile was like a blade. I'm sure we can accommodate you, but I should warn you, my girls are artists. They don't simply perform, they create experiences, memories that last a lifetime. The word memories made Ray's skin crawl. Too close to Dr. Aldrich, too close to the nightmare they just escaped. We're particularly interested in exotic dancing, Elena continued. Asian, perhaps, or Latin. Something with authenticity. Ah, Vivian's eyes sharpened. I'm afraid our Latin selection has been reduced lately. We've lost several girls to other opportunities. But I can recommend our Asian talent. Very authentic, very memorable. She pressed a button on her desk, and a young woman entered. She was beautiful in the way that Hollywood demanded. Perfect features, perfect figure, perfect smile that never reached her eyes. This is Jade, Vivian said. She's very popular with our discerning clientele, very flexible in her performances. Ray watched the girl's face, looking for signs of fear or coercion. What he saw was worse, complete emptiness. She smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but her eyes were dead. We'll need to think about it, Elena said. Perhaps we could speak to some of your other clients? References? Vivian's smile faltered slightly. I'm afraid that's not possible. Discretion is our most important service. Of course, Ray said. We understand completely. As they left the Velvet Room, Ray felt like he needed a shower. The whole place had felt wrong, not just morally but physically, like a trap waiting to spring. Did you see her eyes? Elena asked once they were back in the Plymouth. Which one? Both of them. Vivian's calculating, but that girl, Jade, she was somewhere else entirely. Like she wasn't even there. Ray lit a cigarette and stared out at the city lights. We need to find out what happened to the missing girls. And we need to do it fast. The break came from an unexpected source. Ray was going through the victim's personal effects when he found a small leather journal hidden in Dolores Martinez's purse. Most of the pages were filled with appointment times and client codes, but the last few entries were different. The dreams are getting worse. Can't tell what's real anymore. V says it's normal, part of the process. But I remember things that never happened, places I've never been, people I've never met. Linda is acting strange. Says she remembers being a child in Iowa, but she's from Texas. Says she remembers having a brother, but she's an only child. What's happening to us? Betty won't talk to anyone, just sits and stares. Sometimes she speaks in languages none of us understand. V says she's having a breakdown, but this isn't a breakdown. This is something else. Ray's blood ran cold. The entries were dated just before each woman's death. Elena, he called across the bullpen, you need to see this. Elena read the journal entries with growing horror. Jesus, Ray, this sounds like Aldrich, Ray finished. Someone's messing with their minds, their memories. But Aldrich is dead. We saw him die. Maybe he wasn't the only one. Maybe he had a partner. Or maybe someone else learned his techniques. Elena was already reaching for her coat. We need to talk to that girl, Jade, tonight. It's too dangerous. If we're right about this, she's the next victim. Elena's voice was firm. And I'm not losing another one. Ray knew that tone. It was the same one she'd used when she'd insisted on going undercover to catch Dr. Aldrich. The same one she'd used when she'd saved her own life by recognizing the antidote to Aldrich's memory-stealing drugs. All right, he said, but we do this smart. No more undercover work. We go in as cops this time. Agreed, but first, we need backup, and we need to find out who's really behind this. The answer came from an unexpected source. Ray was reviewing the case files when he noticed something odd about Dr. Aldrich's personal effects. Among his papers was a business card for Sunset Dreams Entertainment and a handwritten note, V. Cross, interested in practical applications. Son of a bitch, Ray muttered. Elena looked up from her desk. What? Vivian Cross knew Aldrich. She was interested in his work. You think she's continuing his experiments? I think she's found a way to commercialize them. Ray lit another cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. Think about it. Rich men paying for the ultimate fantasy. Not just sex, but the experience of being someone else entirely. Living someone else's memories. Elena's face went pale. The girls weren't just being killed. They were being harvested, their memories, their experiences, everything that made them who they were, and then sold to the highest bidder. The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Elena answered it, her face growing more grim with each word. Another body, she said when she hung up. Asian woman, early 20s, found behind the velvet room. Jade. Has to be. Ray stubbed out his cigarette and grabbed his coat. This ends tonight. The velvet room was closed when they arrived, but Ray could see lights in the basement windows. They'd brought backup, 4 uniforms and Detective Murphy, but Ray had a feeling it wouldn't be enough. People like Vivian Cross didn't go down easy. Remember, Elena said as they approached the building, if this is like Aldrich, there might be medical equipment, drugs. Don't touch anything you don't recognize. Ray nodded, checking his .38 one more time. And if we find any of those memory extraction devices, we destroy them, all of them. The basement was larger than it had appeared during their first visit. Behind the main entertainment area, they found a series of smaller rooms equipped with medical equipment that looked disturbingly familiar. IV stands, monitoring equipment, and strange helmet-like devices that Ray recognized from Dr. Aldrich's laboratory. Jesus, Murphy whispered. What is this place? A memory farm, Elena said grimly. They're harvesting these girls' experiences and selling them. They found Vivian Cross in the back room, standing over a young woman strapped to a medical table. The woman was unconscious, with one of the helmet devices attached to her head. Vivian was adjusting dials on a complex control panel. Step away from the equipment, Ray commanded, his gun trained on Vivian. Vivian turned slowly, her face showing no surprise. Detective Castellanos, I was wondering when you'd figure it out. It's over, Vivian. We know what you've been doing. Do you? Vivian smiled that blade-like smile. Do you really understand what I've accomplished here? I've found a way to bottle experience itself, to sell memories, dreams, entire lifetimes to men who've never truly lived. You've been murdering young women. I've been giving them immortality, their memories, their experiences. They live on in my clients, Instead of dying forgotten, they become part of something greater. Elena stepped forward, her own gun drawn. You're insane? Am I? Or am I simply ahead of my time? Vivian's hand moved toward a switch on the control panel. This girl here, she's a dancer from Oklahoma. Poor family, no prospects. But in her memories, she's traveled the world, loved princes, lived a dozen different lives. Imagine what a lonely millionaire would pay for that. Stop, Ray shouted as Vivian reached for the switch. Too late, detective. The machine hummed to life, and the young woman on the table began to convulse. Elena didn't hesitate. She fired twice, the bullets shattering the control panel in a shower of sparks. Vivian screamed and lunged for a backup switch, but Ray was faster. He tackled her to the ground as Murphy rushed to the medical table, frantically unhooking the device from the unconscious woman's head. Is she alive? Elena asked, checking the woman's pulse. Barely, Murphy said, but she's breathing. Ray hauled Vivian to her feet, cuffing her hands behind her back. How many? He demanded. How many girls did you kill? Vivian's smile was gone now, replaced by something cold and calculating. You'll never find them all, and you'll never stop what I've started. There are others, detective, others who understand the value of what I've discovered. Maybe, Ray said, but tonight we stopped you. 2 weeks later, Ray and Elena sat in their apartment, going through the last of the case files. They'd found the bodies of 6 more young women in a warehouse in San Pedro, all victims of Vivian Cross's memory harvesting operation. The woman they'd saved, Maria Santos, a 19-year-old from Tulsa, was recovering in the hospital, her memories intact but fragmented. The doctor says she'll be all right, Elena said, closing the last file. Physically anyway. Mentally, it's going to take time. Ray nodded, staring out at the city lights. Murphy found the client list: judges, politicians, studio executives. Half of them are claiming they didn't know what they were buying. And the other half, lawyered up, but the DA thinks we have enough to make some of it stick. Elena leaned back in her chair, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Sometimes I wonder if we're just fighting shadows. We catch one monster, and 2 more take their place. Ray reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Maybe, but we saved Maria and we stopped Vivian from killing any more girls. Is that enough? Ray thought about Dr. Aldrich, about all the memories he'd stolen, all the lives he'd ended. He thought about the young women who'd died so that rich men could experience their memories, their dreams, their very souls. It has to be, he said finally. We can't save everyone, Elena, but we can save the ones in front of us. We can be the memory keepers, the ones who make sure their stories don't get forgotten. Elena smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. Memory keepers. I like that. Outside, the city hummed with its usual mixture of hope and corruption, dreams and nightmares. But in their small apartment, Ray and Elena Castellanos held each other close, knowing that tomorrow would bring new shadows to fight, new monsters to hunt, and they would be ready. 6 months later, Ray stood in the rain outside the Flamingo Lounge, now closed permanently. The neon signs had been turned off, but he could still see their ghosts in the wet pavement, reflecting memories of light that no longer existed. Elena joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. Thinking about the case? Thinking about the girls, Ray admitted. All of them. The ones we saved and the ones we didn't. Maria's doing better. She called yesterday. She's going back to school. Good. She deserves a chance to make new memories. Elena slipped her arm through his. Come on, detective. Let's go home. We've got work tomorrow. Ray took one last look at the dark building, at the place where Dolores Martinez had died, where their hunt for the memory thief had begun. Then he turned away, walking with his wife into the neon-lit night. Behind them, the city pulsed with its eternal rhythms of crime and punishment, sin and redemption, and somewhere in the shadows, other monsters waited to be hunted. But tonight, Ray and Elena Castellanos walked home together, memory keepers in a city that never forgot its sins, protectors of the stories that might otherwise be lost forever. The neon graveyard glowed softly in the rain, a monument to the dreams that lived and died in the dark heart of Los Angeles. Detective Ray Castellano's case, #6. The bodies started turning up on the night of the lunar eclipse. Ray Castellano stood in the flickering light of the police photographer's flashbulb, watching the crime scene techs work around the corpse of Father Miguel Santos. The priest had been found crucified upside down on the altar of St. Catherine's Church, his throat slashed, strange symbols carved into his chest. "Third one this week," Elena said, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. Marriage hadn't softened her edges. If anything, working cases together had made her more precise, more deadly. All religious figures, all killed during significant lunar phases. Ray knelt beside the body, studying the symbols. They weren't random. Each cut was deliberate, purposeful. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. Father Santos was popular in the Mexican community, spoke out against the gangs moving drugs through East LA. "Maybe this isn't about religion," Elena suggested. "Maybe someone's using the ritual elements to cover up something else." Detective Murphy approached, his face grim in the candlelight. "Coroner's preliminary says he was alive when they strung him up, died slow, and Ray," Murphy's voice dropped, "there's something else. We found this pinned to the confessional." He handed Ray a piece of paper with a message written in what looked like blood. "The lamb must bleed before the shepherd can rise. 3 down, 4 to go." Elena read over Ray's shoulder. 7 total, biblical number. "Great," Ray muttered. "A religious maniac with a body count plan." The church was thick with incense and the lingering smell of fear. Ray had seen plenty of murder scenes, but something about this one felt different. The symbols, the positioning of the body, the theatrical nature of it all. It felt like a performance, like the killer was trying to send a message to someone specific. "Who were the first 2 victims?" Elena asked Murphy. "Rabbi David Goldstein, found 3 nights ago in his synagogue. Throat cut, same symbols. And before that, Reverend James Washington at the Baptist Church on Crenshaw. Same MO, same symbols." Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Jewish, Baptist, Catholic, the killer's working his way through different faiths. "But why?" Elena stubbed out her cigarette. "What's the connection?" "Maybe there isn't one," Ray said. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the killer wants us to think it's about religion when it's really about something else entirely." Elena studied the symbols carved into the priest's chest. "These look familiar. Not the religious iconography, something else. Like I've seen them before." Ray trusted Elena's instincts. She had a memory for details that had saved their lives more than once. "Where?" "I don't know yet, but I will." The next morning found Ray and Elena in the basement archives of the Los Angeles Times, going through old newspaper clippings. If the symbols meant something, chances were they'd appeared somewhere before. The city had a long history of cults, occult murders, and religious fanatics. "Here," Elena said, pulling out a yellowed clipping from 1952, "multiple murders, ritualistic elements, similar symbols. But look at this. The killer was never caught." Ray read over her shoulder. 7 victims, all killed during lunar phases, all found with the same symbols carved into their bodies. The last murder had been a prominent minister who'd been speaking out against organized crime's influence in the city. "Same pattern," Ray said. "Religious figures, lunar timing, ritual elements. But that was 15 years ago. Maybe the killer's back. Maybe they've been waiting. Or maybe someone's copying the original murders." Ray lit a lucky strike, thinking, "We need to find out who survived from the original investigation." Elena was already flipping through more clippings. The lead detective was named Thomas Brennan, retired in 1960, still alive, living in Pasadena. "Let's pay him a visit." Thomas Brennan lived in a small bungalow surrounded by orange trees, the kind of place that looked peaceful until you noticed the bars on the windows and the locks on the doors. He was a thin man in his 70s, with the cautious eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "The lunar killer," he said when Ray and Elena showed him the crime scene photos. "I was wondering when he'd come back." "You think it's the same person?" Elena asked. "Could be, or could be someone who knows the original case inside and out." Brennan poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour. "We never caught him. Came close once, but he vanished after the 7th murder." just disappeared. What can you tell us about the pattern? Ray asked. 7 victims, all killed during lunar phases. The symbols were never in any book we could find. Not Christian, not Jewish, not pagan. Like he made them up himself. Brennan's hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. But there was something else. Something we never released to the press. He went to an old filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs of the original crime scenes, along with detailed notes in faded ink. Each victim had something taken, Brennan continued. Something personal. The rabbi's prayer book, the minister's Bible, the priest's crucifix. We thought it was trophies at first, but then we realized he wasn't keeping them. He was giving them to someone else. Elena leaned forward. What do you mean? 3 days after each murder, the stolen item would show up somewhere else, always at a location that was significant to the victim. The rabbi's prayer book appeared at his daughter's wedding. The minister's Bible turned up at a charity he'd founded, like the killer was returning them, but only after he'd used them for something. Ray felt the pieces clicking together. Use them for what? That's what we never figured out. But I had a theory. Brennan's voice dropped. I think he was trying to steal more than just their lives. I think he was trying to steal their faith itself. That night, Ray and Elena sat in their car outside St. Mary's Cathedral, watching for any sign of unusual activity. If the killer was following the original pattern, he'd strike again soon. The lunar eclipse was approaching, and they'd found evidence suggesting the cathedral's Archbishop Morrison might be the next target. You think Brennan was right? Elena asked. About the faith stealing? I think people will kill for stranger reasons, Ray said. But this feels bigger than just one person's obsession. Elena was quiet for a moment, then, I remember where I saw those symbols before. Where? The Aldrich case, not in his lab, but in his personal effects. He had a notebook with sketches of similar symbols, like he was studying them. Ray's blood ran cold. You think there's a connection? I think there are more monsters in this city than we ever imagined, and I think they're all connected somehow. A movement in the shadows caught Ray's attention. A figure in dark clothing was approaching the cathedral's side entrance, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly where they were going. That's him, Ray said, reaching for his gun. Wait, Elena cautioned. Let's see what he does first. They watched as the figure produced a key and unlocked the door. Not a break-in. Whoever this was had legitimate access to the cathedral. Someone on the inside, Elena whispered. The figure disappeared into the building, and Ray and Elena moved to follow. The cathedral was vast and dark, lit only by scattered candles and the faint glow of stained glass windows. They could hear movement somewhere toward the altar, the sound of something being dragged across stone. Ray signaled for Elena to circle around to the left, while he approached from the right. They'd done this dance before, and they moved together like they'd been partners for decades instead of just a few years. The altar was lit by dozens of candles arranged in a complex pattern. In the center, Archbishop Morrison lay unconscious but alive, his hands bound with rope. Standing over him was a figure in dark robes, face hidden by a hood. Police! Ray shouted, his gun trained on the figure. Step away from the Archbishop! The figure turned slowly, and Ray saw a face he recognized from the cathedral staff photos. Father David Mulcahy, Morrison's assistant. But his eyes were different now, filled with a fervor that bordered on madness. You're too late, Mulcahy said calmly. The ritual has already begun. What ritual? Elena demanded, keeping her gun steady. The gathering of faith, the collection of souls. Mulcahy smiled, and Ray saw that his teeth were stained with something dark. Do you know what happens when you steal someone's faith, detective? When you take the very thing that makes them believe in something greater than themselves? You become a monster, Ray said. You become a god. Mulcahy raised a knife, its blade gleaming in the candlelight. 7 faiths, 7 souls, 7 steps to transcendence. Elena fired without hesitation, the bullet catching Mulcahy in the shoulder and spinning him away from the Archbishop. But instead of falling, he laughed, a sound that echoed through the cathedral like breaking glass. You can't stop what's already begun, he said, pulling something from his robes. It was a small vial filled with dark liquid. The blood of the faithful, freely given. Ray realized with horror that Mulcahy was talking about the stolen items, the prayer books, the Bibles, the crucifixes. He hadn't just taken them as trophies, he'd used them in some kind of ritual, extracting something from them, something that had once belonged to the victims. The original killer, Elena said, understanding dawning in her voice. He didn't disappear. He passed the ritual on to someone else. To me, Mulcahy confirmed, my grandfather. He taught me the old ways, the true ways. Faith is power, detective, and power should belong to those strong enough to take it. Ray moved closer, his gun never wavering. It's over, Mulcahy. We know about the pattern. We know about the symbols. We'll find the others. Others? Mulcahy's smile widened. You think I'm alone in this? You think faith is the only thing worth stealing? He raised the vial to his lips, and Ray shot him twice in the chest. Mulcahy fell backward, the vial shattering against the altar steps, its contents spreading across the stone like spilled wine. Archbishop Morrison stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Father Mulcahy? He whispered. What happened? Nothing you need to worry about, Elena said gently, cutting the ropes that bound him. You're safe now. But as Ray knelt beside Mulcahy's body, he found something that made his blood run cold. In the priest's pocket was a list of names, not just religious figures, but doctors, teachers, social workers, people who helped others, people who gave hope to the hopeless. And at the bottom of the list, in different handwriting, was a note. The harvest continues. Faith is only the beginning. 2 weeks later, Ray and Elena sat in their apartment, going through the evidence from the Mulcahy case. They'd found the location where he'd been performing his rituals, a basement beneath an abandoned church in Boyle Heights, filled with stolen religious artifacts and the remains of his victims' faith. The coroner found something interesting, Elena said, looking up from the forensic report. Mulcahy's blood chemistry was off, like he'd been taking some kind of drug, but not any drug they recognized. The liquid in the vial? Maybe, or maybe something else. Something that made him believe he could actually steal faith. Ray stared out at the city lights, thinking about monsters and the people who made them. You think he was right? About there being others? I think there are always others, Elena said. People who want to take what doesn't belong to them. People who think they can steal souls. Then we'll find them. All of them. Elena smiled, the same smile that had made him fall in love with her years ago. Memory keepers and soul guardians. We're really moving up in the world. Ray laughed, but it was hollow. He thought about the list they'd found, about all the names they hadn't been able to save, about the note at the bottom that suggested this was just the beginning. Outside, the city hummed with its usual mixture of hope and corruption, faith and doubt, and somewhere in the shadows, other monsters waited to be hunted. But tonight, Ray and Elena Castellanos held each other close, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horrors to face, and they would be ready. The next morning, Ray's phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Murphy, and his voice was tight with tension. Ray, we've got another one, but this time it's different. How different? The victim is Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who worked with trauma victims, found in her office. But Ray, she wasn't killed. She's alive, but she's different. She keeps saying she doesn't remember who she is. Ray felt a familiar chill run down his spine. Her memories? Gone. All of them. Like someone reached into her head and took everything that made her who she was. Ray looked at Elena, who was already reaching for her clothes. We're on our way. As they drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward the crime scene, Ray thought about Mulcahy's words. Faith is only the beginning. He thought they were dealing with a religious fanatic, but maybe they'd been wrong. Maybe they were dealing with something much worse. Maybe they were dealing with someone who had learned to steal souls. The city stretched out before them, full of secrets and shadows, full of people who needed protection from the monsters that walked among them. And Ray and Elena Castellanos drove into the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. Because someone had to stand between the monsters and the innocent. Someone had to be the guardians of what made people human. The end. So close your eyes. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this. Some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night. So close your eyes. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this. Some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.